In March 2003, the United States, United Kingdom and their coalition allies launched Operation Iraqi Freedom, a war to depose Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. The campaign went relatively well. The coalition methodically advanced north and captured Baghdad without serious casualties. However, Operation Iraqi Freedom was plagued by constant problems during its planning phase. Multiple revisions, political interference, and in large parts based on sketchy or flat-out false assumptions, it can be argued that military disaster was avoided only through the efforts of several key officers who successfully stood their ground on key aspects of the plan. In this video, we will discuss the military strategy and planning for Operation Iraqi Freedom. Furthermore, the military and post-war consequences of the planning process will also be examined.
Hold on 7, this is Group 1, troops in contact. Coordinates to follow.
The United States already had contingency war plans for Iraq before planning for the 2003 invasion was ever considered. During the 1990s, United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, developed a plan to depose Saddam should he try to invade Kuwait again. Op Plan 100398 called for 3 corps and a Marine Expeditionary Force to push the enemy out of Kuwait before attacking north into Iraq itself. The operation would have involved over 400,000 troops, who would be needed for stabilising the country following the presumed fall of Saddam's government. This was CENTCOM's official war plan for Iraq before President George W. Bush assumed office in January 2001. The first serious attempts to build a new plan came 2 days after 9/11. On the 13th of September, members of the US Third Army's planning staff were pulled into a windowless room and informed they had just 72 hours to sketch a plan to seize and hold Iraq's southern oil fields. Lieutenant Colonel James Danner, the Chief 5th Corps War Planner, finalised and expanded the plan, which was given the name Vigilant Guardian. In a hypothetical Operation Vigilant Guardian, an invasion force of between 75,000 to 100,000 troops would take 30 to 45 days to deploy to Kuwait. When the attack came, the American forces would be expected to occupy the southern half of Iraq in 4 days. The ground forces would stop 75 miles south of Baghdad and establish a security zone to prevent Saddam's army from counterattacking. Although it was a thrown-together contingency, Vigilant Guardian reflected many of the assumptions that would guide the actual invasion plan. American military officers predicted that the Iraqi military was so weakened by sanctions that it would collapse easily, and that the United States would be treated as liberators by the predominantly Shia population of southern Iraq. However, Vigilant Guardian would also be the last plan to not involve the direct supervision of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was in his second stint as Secretary of Defense, and was determined to control the planning process for the invasion of Iraq. He saw himself as an innovator, and intended to transform the US military into a leaner force. On the 21st of November 2001, Rumsfeld met with CENTCOM Commander General Tommy Franks to discuss the regime change in Iraq. Acting mostly of his own accord, Rumsfeld laid out his criteria for what the campaign should look like. The Defense Secretary emphasized to the General that the invasion had to have the element of surprise. Both the deployment and attack needed to be quick, and it had to use the fewest number of troops possible. He even suggested that the invasion should start before all of the American forces earmarked for the operation could be deployed to the Middle East, arguing that they could be fed into the advance as reinforcements. General Franks took Rumsfeld's criteria and formulated a plan that would shrink the American troop contingent from over 400,000 to 275,000 and take 45 to 135 days to secure the country. About half of that number would join the invasion as it was happening. The initial deployment time would be 90 days. For Rumsfeld, this plan took too long and used too many troops. He ordered Franks and his staff to return to the planning table. In the meantime, Rumsfeld had been introduced to Colonel Douglas Macgregor by former Speaker of the House of Representatives Newt Gingrich. Gingrich was a member of the Defense Advisory Board and had recommended Macgregor for his unorthodox thinking. Macgregor argued that a force of just 17,000 troops could defeat Saddam in 96 hours behind a powerful armoured attack aimed at Baghdad. For Rumsfeld, this was the bold, innovative thinking that was lacking in the modern army. He arranged a meeting between Macgregor and Franks' staff in January of 2002. It did not go well. In an initial meeting with Colonel Mike Fitzgerald, one of CENTCOM's chief planners, McGregor dismissed Fitzgerald's concerns about logistics and even argued that artillery was not needed for the invasion. Fitzgerald, an artilleryman, was so disgusted that he walked out. Franks and the rest of his staff believed that McGregor's ideas had no basis in reality, but Defense Secretary Rumsfeld was convinced that the generals were relying on old thinking. The Doug McGregor episode was an ominous sign that Rumsfeld intended to intimately involve himself in the planning for Operation Iraqi Freedom. On the 1st of February 2002, Franks presented his new plan to Rumsfeld, codenamed Generated Start. Under Generated Start, the air and ground forces would deploy to the Middle East in 60 days, and once again involve attacking Iraq before all US forces were in place. Rumsfeld rejected the plan again and ordered a new one where deployment would take just 30 days. Franks now realised that this could not be done unless the United States had access to foreign bases, and emphasised that a coalition would be needed in order to satisfy Rumsfeld's demands. Franks went on a tour of the Middle East to persuade potential allies to allow US troops on their soil, while CENTCOM struggled to formulate a plan to Rumsfeld's liking. Tensions between the war planners and the Pentagon continued to rise during the spring of 2002. At one point, General Franks' subordinates learned that representatives from the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy to CENTCOM were feeding confidential information about the planning process to Defense Secretary Rumsfeld. They were outed as moles and expelled from CENTCOM's planning team. The interference from Rumsfeld would become so bad that even Newt Gingrich, who sided with the Defense Secretary on most issues, warned him to stop micromanaging the military. Gingrich joked, "The worst they can do is take away my designated parking spot at the Pentagon." At the same time, a new problem emerged: what to do with American air power. Rumsfeld insisted upon a lightning-quick invasion defined by shock and awe, and rejected the need for a long drawn-out air campaign similar to Desert Storm. However, Buzz Mosley, the air war commander, vehemently argued that he needed at least 10 to 14 days to destroy Iraqi air defences. Eventually, a compromise was reached. American aircraft would systematically pummel key enemy installations in the months before the invasion under the guise of Operation Southern Focus, the ongoing campaign to enforce the Iraqi no-fly zone. This would satisfy Mosley's demand for more time and reassure Rumsfeld that the war would not drag on. As a result, Operation Iraqi Freedom would be a rarity in modern warfare in that the invasion-specific air campaign and the ground campaign would start at roughly the same time. More plans were developed throughout 2002, the most controversial of which was nicknamed the Running Start. The Running Start most resembled Colonel McGregor's plan. It called for 18,000 troops to assemble in Kuwait within 25 days before striking into Iraq. Rumsfeld was pleased that both the deployment time and troop count had been shaved to drastically lower numbers, but other key figures were alarmed. Chief of the United Kingdom's Defence Staff, Sir Michael Boyce, described the Running Start as a hazardous option, and did not believe that the United States had a workable plan. The other concerned party was the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs believed that war could not be fought on the cheap, and urged for a plan that relied more on a larger invasion force, larger logistics build-up, and increased weight of fire. Secretary of State Colin Powell had overseen Operation Desert Storm, and was also concerned with the lack of attention given to logistics and security behind the advance. Rumsfeld dismissed their concerns as legacy thinking. The appointment of Lieutenant General Dave McKiernan as the overall ground commander in September of 2002 was a turning point in the planning for Operation Iraqi Freedom. McKiernan reviewed the newest plans and believed they were solely deficient in manpower, unnecessarily complex, and lacked enough firepower to win the war quickly. McKiernan felt vindicated in his view when his staff conducted a war game to test the newest plan, nicknamed the Hybrid. Retired General Fred Franks, not to be confused with Tommy Franks, who had led the American 7th Corps in Desert Storm, observed the exercise before giving his own opinion that the plan was fatally flawed. The most pressing concern was the lack of initial combat power, which could carry the advance all the way to Baghdad. Thus, he began work on his own plan, which he codenamed Cobra II, after the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead in the Second World War. On the 5th of December 2002, McKiernan presented Cobra II to General Franks. The new plan called for adding an entire division to the 86,000-strong invasion force, along with 2 more Marine regimental combat teams, and additional logistics and air support. He ditched the more complicated aspects of the previous plans and argued for 2 separate pushes, one from the Army and one from the Marines, that would converge on Baghdad. At the same time, the US 4th Infantry Division would attack out of Turkey to tie down Iraqi forces in the north. Franks was impressed with the plan and gave it his approval, but most surprisingly, Rumsfeld also liked the plan. It met the requirements for a fast campaign with little build-up, even if it used more troops than he would have liked. The headaches would not stop though, as the deployment process also turned into an ordeal. Rumsfeld believed that the United States had sent more forces and supplies than needed for Operation Desert Storm in 1991, and was determined to control the deployment in addition to the plan. Rumsfeld was especially concerned with deploying as few reservists as possible, arguing instead that any reserves should be stationed in the continental United States until they were absolutely needed for the drive on Baghdad. He was still obsessed with keeping the manpower deployment count as low as possible. When US Army Chief of Staff Eric Shinseki testified in front of Congress on the 25th of February 2003, he estimated that it would take several 100,000 troops to control Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Rumsfeld was furious that one of the Joint Chiefs had contradicted his thinking and attempted to have Shinseki reprimanded. Secretary of the Army Tom White stood his ground, and Rumsfeld dropped the subject. To those in the military tasked with carrying out the deployment, it appeared as though Rumsfeld had no idea what reservists actually did. The 17,000 reserve troops that McKiernan requested would be vital for securing supply lines and pacifying rear areas. Keeping them in the United States would actively harm the advance. As one of his subordinates later said, "We often joked that we would like to be able to invite Mr. Rumsfeld down here to say to him, 'Mr. Secretary, meet Isaac Newton. We live in a Newtonian world. We cannot change the size of the ocean or the distance between the United States and Iraq. With no maintenance problems, it takes 21 days to sail from Texas to Kuwait.' Having them so far away from the combat area would be pointless because they could not be deployed fast enough if needed at the front." However, Rumsfeld would get his way because the Bush administration apparently had a great plan for getting more manpower in theatre. The CIA had intelligence which suggested that entire divisions or brigades of the Iraqi army would switch sides and fight for the invaders. CENTCOM developed a plan that would use members of the Iraqi regular army to control the country's borders and take on other tasks to help overstretched coalition forces. These men would also be augmented by Iraqi freedom fighters, who would be armed by the CIA and flown into the country once the invasion began. Rumsfeld also suggested letting other Arab nations field additional security forces, but McKiernan vehemently disagreed with this premise, arguing that it would be problematic for soliciting post-war aid for the Iraqis. He humoured the Defence Secretary, but his staff never drew up such a plan. Ultimately, nowhere near as many enemy soldiers surrendered to the coalition to serve these purposes, much less an entire brigade. To complete the embarrassing episode, the CIA never recruited enough Iraqi nationals, ending the entire plan. As Michael R. Gordon and Bernard E. Trainor wrote in their book Cobra II, The Inside Story of the Invasion and Occupation of Iraq, the Bush administration was not only confident that it would quickly defeat the Iraqi military, but also counted on Iraqi forces to work under American supervision and even to help police the occupation. Rarely has a military plan depended on such a bold assumption. While this saga was occurring, Rumsfeld continued to make CENTCOM's life hard. Just before Christmas of 2002, General J.D. Thurman, McKiernan's operations deputy, was summoned to the Pentagon to discuss the deployment process. According to Cobra II, Thurman had to go down the list of individual reserve units name by name and insist they be deployed. In late 2002, President Bush decided to take the case for war against Iraq to the United Nations, which gave CENTCOM breathing space to complete preparations for the invasion, and they needed it because the planned Northern Front was in deep trouble. On the 1st of March 2003, Turkey's parliament rejected a measure to allow coalition troops to attack Iraq through Turkish territory. This was a serious situation, as General McKiernan estimated that he needed a minimum of 35,000 troops to attack from the north and put pressure on the Iraqi army. However, Secretary of State Powell believed a northern front would be unnecessary and wanted to recall the US 4th Infantry Division, which was currently waiting on ships in the Mediterranean Sea for Turkey to give them permission to land. Both Powell and McKiernan thought that if the 4th Infantry Division couldn't take part in the invasion from the north, it might as well be deployed to Kuwait and insist in the invasion from there. Yet, General Franks rejected this idea. He believed keeping the 4th Infantry Division in the Mediterranean would keep the Iraqis guessing and prevent them from concentrating all of their forces in the south. Powell argued that any enemy divisions moving south would be easy targets for American air power. In the end, Franks won the battle and kept the 4th Infantry Division out of combat until it was redirected to Kuwait towards the end of the campaign. However, Powell was proven right that the unit's presence in Turkey had no effect on the invasion. General Thurman later remarked in the summer of 2003 that not committing the 4th Infantry Division to action earlier was a huge mistake. We wanted more combat power on the ground, but the decision was made way late to move the 4th ID south. We've still got people getting shot by insurgents and dying up there right now. We've got to clean that up. Against all odds, the coalition invasion forces were ready by the 20th of March 2003, and the invasion began on schedule. So what were the consequences of this chaotic planning process? For one, coalition forces figured out quickly that their logistics were far more vulnerable than initially expected. The lack of reservists to guard captured territory and escort supply columns had a negative impact on the drive towards Baghdad. American commanders in the field found their supply lines constantly harassed by Iraqi militia or paramilitary groups such as the Fedayeen. A year after the invasion, an investigation by former Defense Secretary James Shedslinger determined that Donald Rumsfeld's decision to take the deployment process out of the military's hands contributed to the chaos that would engulf Iraq following the invasion. Reserve units arrived without much of their equipment, and the general lack of troops left the coalition forces spread too thin to effectively police the country. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld's determination to control every aspect of the invasion down to the battalion level created a rift between the civilians in charge at the Pentagon, the military in the field, and the Joint Chiefs, who were essentially ignored. Later, Colin Powell would tell President Bush in a private meeting that the national security decision-making process was broken. Rumsfeld's constant interference in military matters was unprecedented in post-Vietnam American military experience. At one point, the Defense Secretary so infuriated General Franks that he confronted Rumsfeld after a particularly exhausting conversation. "Mr. Secretary, stop. This ain't gonna work. You can fire me. I'm either the commander or I'm not, and you've got to trust me or you don't. And if you don't, I need to go somewhere else. Tell me what it is, Mr. Secretary." Rumsfeld backed down. The invasion of Iraq was a military success in that Saddam Hussein's government was overthrown without unacceptable coalition casualties. However, the actual planning for the campaign was fraught with problems that would eventually manifest themselves during the war. It certainly didn't help matters that Tommy Franks would prove to be a controversial commander in the field, but that is a story for a different upcoming video. The most serious consequences would be felt after the fall of Saddam's regime. Whereas Operation Iraqi Freedom was a hastily thrown together plan with many flaws, the plan for rebuilding post-war Iraq was borderline non-existent. Thanks again to our amazing patrons who make series like this possible. Welcome to all our new patrons this month, and a special thanks to our patron of the week, the man they call Asher. Each week we select our favourite Patreon reactions to shout out. This week, Isaf Ace says, "As the military geniuses among us should know, planning an invasion around the premise of don't worry, they probably won't shoot back much isn't the best idea." And Ort, who says, "Learning Rumsfeld's effect on the invasion is horrifying in such an expected way." If you'd like to join our Patreon and get access to exclusive benefits such as early access to videos ad and sponsor free, we would love to have you as part of our community.